welcome to the Cradle News Roundup, a weekly space where we will discuss some of the most important developments from the past week in West Asia and the world. As you all know, the Cradle is a geopolitical news magazine based out of West Asia. My name is Esteban Carrillo. I am the head of news of the Cradle. Today, I am joined by William Van Wagenen, American journalist. How are you, Will?
Good. How are you? Good to be here.
Yeah, good to be here for the first episode of the Cradle News Roundup. So today, we're going to start off with what is honestly the most important news happening right now, and that's Gaza. The Israeli ground invasion into Gaza that is leaving hell behind. And most recently, what happened over the weekend, and especially what's happening today, is these attacks on hospitals, on medical facilities. A few days ago, the Israeli army essentially took complete control of Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City. This is the largest medical complex in Gaza. There were about, I believe estimates put about 5,000 people, displaced people, between displaced and patients at Al-Shifa. Now the Israeli army had been bombing it for days. They entered and they forced the Palestinians to leave, including the patients. Families had to carry their own wounded. Only a very, very minimal amount remained. And now officials are saying Al-Shifa can no longer function as a hospital. And today, the day we're recording this, they're attacking Indonesian hospital in Gaza as well. Now, their claim is that these are Hamas command centers, no? This is what they've been saying.
Yeah.
And what is the evidence, What did they show in Al-Shifa? They took 2 days to show what was essentially 3 duffel bags, a bunch of rusty old weapons with no munition clips, a handful of grenades, 2 copies of the Quran, a box of dates, an open box of dates, and, flak jackets, just like, you don't expect to see this in a Hamas command center.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there wasn't a Hamas command center, but when they took control of the hospital, that obviously gave them the chance to just bring items into the hospital that they could plant essentially in the hospital to make it look like Hamas had some type of presence there. But no one is even buying it. Even the BBC, which is obviously clearly pro-Israeli in almost all cases, they did a report showing that the Israeli claims were fabricated, that the Israeli army itself had just brought the weapons in. And that's a common tactic that U.S. soldiers used to use in Iraq during the occupation after 2003. They would go into a house, raid the house, murder the father, the mother, the kids, or even just out in the street somewhere. If they would shoot a guy, they would always keep some AK-47s with them, and then they would just they call them throw weapons, if I remember. They would throw the AK-47 down on the ground next to the fighter or plant it in the home of the family that they had just murdered. And then they could point to that and say, oh, look, they were militants,
Yeah, exactly.
So the Israelis are just using the same tactic. And then even the humanitarian aid they were supposedly bringing in, because obviously it looks terrible for them to be shutting hospitals down. There was that video of the soldiers,
carrying the empty boxes. These boxes are floated in the air, essentially.
Yeah, so it's just Hollywood-style manipulation. Yeah.
And to your point about the practices of the U.S. Army in Iraq, the British Army right now, they're also under investigation. I believe, I don't know if there's charges being brought against some about this same practice in Afghanistan of, kill all fighting-age males, regardless of whether they're fighters or not, and then plant the evidence. So the raid in Shifa hospital, it was launched under the pretenses that the Israelis had intelligence showing a command center. Everybody saw this 3D rendering, this CGI, of a Shifa hospital, and underneath a giant tunnel of Hamas, infrastructure and the base right underneath. What they have shown so far is an entrance to a tunnel. And even the BBC, even CNN is questioning, even they, maybe not questioning so much as just, being a bit doubtful. They are like, Israel hasn't yet shown evidence. They are not saying, no, Israel is lying. They're saying, well, we haven't actually seen yet evidence that this is happening. And then there's also, that they took essentially almost 2 days to even show these rusty old weapons. If they knew all of this, what took them so long? This was a place where there were displaced, wounded civilians, doctors. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, and the Israelis too are claiming that, or people in the media have been pointing out that there were tunnels underneath the hospital that were built actually by the Israelis back in the 1980s when Israel directly occupied Gaza. And so that was supposedly the proof that Hamas was using it as a command center. But again, they put out that whole CGI, artistic depiction of this huge compound that was supposedly underneath it. And then all they did was bring in some bulldozers after they took control of the hospital, and they found like a few tunnels. One was like a well, So anyways, the Israelis know, of course, that there's no Hamas command center there. But they just say it in advance to give a pretext to attack the hospital, take it over, shut it down. And it's important to think about, why do they want to shut hospitals down? And that goes back to, number one, the Israelis have always attacked civilians, always attacked civilian infrastructure. We see that every time there's a war, whether it's in 2008 or in 2014. The Israelis do the same thing, attacking civilian infrastructure on purpose. But in this case, it's pretty clear. They are trying to move the entire population of Gaza first to the south of Gaza, and then secondly, hopefully, they're trying to move them to Egypt. And if they can just make Gaza totally uninhabitable, totally destroy the entire health system, destroy enough city blocks of housing, and just make Gaza totally unlivable, even apart from all the bombs that are raining down on everybody, then they can push everyone, eventually to Egypt. So that's really the strategy in attacking the hospitals. And of course, they just have to come up with some pretext in advance. And then once the hospital is either destroyed or taken over, then of course they just move on to the next thing. So it doesn't even matter if their propaganda is really that good. They just need to make the claims in advance, have the U.S. repeat the claims.
Exactly, because
and then once the hospital's out of service or destroyed, then they're happy, even if no one believes their story.
Because the raid on Shifa, it was launched right after the U.S. came out and said that they also had intelligence. It was right away,
And then it turns out the U.S. said, "Oh, well, actually, our intelligence was just the Israelis' intelligence."
Yeah, it's just
a circular game.
At some point, it feels like they're not even trying anymore, And anybody who's continuing to repeat these claims, it doesn't make any sense. Besides what you just described, this thing of let's just get rid of the population of Gaza, because what's going to happen to Gaza if all of a sudden tomorrow they say, okay, we'll have a ceasefire and we will have discussions? The place is decimated. The Israelis, since before this happened, they control the electricity supply, the water supply. What went in? Nobody would go out. Nobody could go out of Gaza. Barely anybody could go in. And now we're seeing it even worse. The humanitarian aid is barely trickling in. And it's not just hospitals they're targeting, because on Saturday they targeted, I believe it was 3 schools. 2 of them UN schools. They just drop bombs there where the refugees are. And what is this again? Under the claim that this is a Hamas base. Apparently everything in Gaza is a Hamas base.
But again, that's the important thing, I think, is to see what is their strategy, because there's been this kind of argument between the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Prime Minister Netanyahu about what will happen in Gaza after Hamas supposedly will be defeated. They are claiming that for sure Hamas will be defeated, which of course is not for sure at all. But if they were able to defeat Hamas, Blinken is saying the Palestinian Authority should be brought in to govern Gaza, and there's some rumors that the U.S. wants Mohammed Dahlan to come back and rule Gaza. He's a former Fatah strongman that was from Gaza that had a presence there back in 2005, 2006. But then on the other hand, Netanyahu is saying, no, well, the Israelis, we're going to control security in Gaza for the indefinite future. Of course, he doesn't want to do that if there are actually any Palestinians left there. But he wants to do that because there's all this pressure from the right wing, from the religious settlers, followed by
from the extreme right, yeah.
Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. They all want to return to Gaza, get rid of the Gazans, reoccupy it and annex it and rebuild the settlement block, Gush Katif, that was dismantled back in 2005 under Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan. So you can see that for Netanyahu, he wants the war to keep going as long as possible and to complete the annexation of Gaza. Also, there's all the natural gas off the coast of Gaza that was discovered that the Israelis, of course, want to get their hands on. So that's their end game, whereas the Americans, it's just despicable that they are they're making no effort to stop the killing of Palestinians at all.
Now, come on, Will.
But they just have a slightly different idea of what the end game will be, which is, we'll just put the Palestinian Authority back in, and then they'll, control everything for us. So
they're
both
calling
plans
for
are terrible. But
for a humanitarian pause. Like give them a couple of hours during the day at least. That's the best that the White House seems to be willing to ask.
Yeah.
And it's
stall the genocide for 4 hours a day and then let it keep going.
Exactly. Don't bomb the school at noon. Bomb it at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
It's honestly absurd. But staying in Gaza, something very interesting happened over the past few days. And this is an Israeli police report that said that an unknown number of Israelis were killed by the Israeli army during the October 7th raid, when Hamas and other Palestinian factions broke through the separation wall. And the Nova Music Festival, that's what they're saying. This rave that was happening in the desert near the separation wall, is, where you want to go party on a weekend. That it was helicopters, that it was the Apache helicopters that Israel deployed, that they was firing on these revelers, on these party goers. And this aligns with stuff we had been hearing for the past few weeks, essentially since 7 October. We have been hearing a lot of reports that not all of the deaths were caused by Hamas. And now, in particular, the deaths that are being questioned now are Israelis who apparently burned to death, that were razed to the ground. We've seen the pictures of the cars completely burned down. And we know Hamas, they came in with weapons. They came in with guns, with rifles. They didn't come in with anything that would have set that amount of fire, And then there's also the reports of that we know of the tanks firing on homes, on the settlements, where inside there were Hamas fighters, but there were also settlers, or there were also Israeli police.
Yeah, so again, we have been hearing, there's been a few reports kind of trickling out, and the first one was from an Israeli woman named Yasmin Porat, who was actually at the Nova Music Festival. And when Hamas began firing rockets, of course, the festival goers began fleeing. She left the festival with her partner and escaped to this kibbutz, the settlement nearby called Be'eri. And then she was hiding in a home with other members of the kibbutz when Hamas came, took over the home, and took them captive. And according to this woman, Yasmin Porat, the Hamas fighters treated them well. They weren't trying to murder them. They were just trying to take them captive and take them back to Gaza. But then the Israeli military responded, and they showed up and just started opening fire. They killed 4 or 5 hostages in the crossfire of trying to hit the Hamas guys. But then, as there was 15 hostages inside this one home, along with maybe 40 Hamas guys, the Israeli army shot 2 tank shells into the home and just destroyed it and killed all the people inside. And this woman, Yasmin Porat, she was able to escape the home just before it was destroyed. So that was like the first indication that the Israelis had maybe had implemented something called the Hannibal Directive, which means that is a doctrine of the Israeli military, usually applying to soldiers, which says, hey, if one of our soldiers is going to be captured, it's better and taken hostage. We would rather kill that soldier than let them be taken captive, because then our enemies will have leverage against us. They'll be able to we'll have to release maybe, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners just to get, or the Palestinians who have been kidnapped by the Israelis, we'll have to exchange them for the one soldier that they have of ours. So that's has happened numerous times, but this is a case where it looks like the Israelis did that like on a mass scale, where they saw that many of their civilians were being taken captive, and then they just opened fire and were willingly or deliberately killed not only the Hamas guys but also their own Israelis who were held captive.
And now this begs the question: does Israel see their own civilians as members of the military? Would this give them justification, especially if we consider this Hannibal doctrine? And while this account of the Apache helicopter at this point seems to be getting almost forcibly disputed, we know these other accounts. We know the ones that you just described about the attacks on the houses or the crossfire. The people who were held that said they would say the Israeli army came in firing. They didn't come in and ask. They didn't come in and try to see, if there were Israelis here. They just came in firing. So, what do you think? Do you think this is how Israel is essentially saying? What Israel is essentially saying about their civilians, that they are part of the military?
Well, that could be, because in one other incident in Sderot, Hamas fighters had taken over a police station and they took 12 police captive. And the Israeli army showed up and did the same thing. They just shot tank shells into the police station, destroyed it, and then right after everyone was killed inside, both the Israeli police and the Hamas fighters, then they just bulldozed the entire police station, which eliminated evidence of what happened. But the media reports are there that that's what happened. So, but in the case of the concert, like you mentioned, this recent police report said that the Apache helicopters came to the Nova rave on the Gaza border there, and the Apache helicopters opened fire, and they knew that they couldn't distinguish between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and they opened fire anyway. So you're right. The question is, why would they do that? Again, the Hannibal directive seemed to come into play because most of the people at that concert were young Israelis in their 20s and 30s, which means that they are people who had completed their military service. Maybe they were still active duty military, or they were in the reserves, or they were former military that could still be called up for reserves. And so if any of those people were, kidnapped or taken captive by Hamas, that would be the exact same problem. It's not a big difference if someone who is in the reserves is held captive by Hamas in Gaza versus someone who was actually captured while in the middle of a battle. So again, it does seem like the Hannibal directive was implemented, and there was a former Israeli top official in the Mossad and in the IDF, and a reserve Air Force colonel, if I remember correctly, who did an interview with Haaretz recently, where he said that when the Apache helicopters again responded, they were firing at vehicles and people trying to cross back from Israel into Gaza, and the Apache helicopters just opened fire on all of them, like at all these different places. And so this reservist Air Force colonel, he basically called it a mass Hannibal event, where instead of just like, hey, there's this one Israeli soldier that we don't want him or her to be taken captive, so we're going to blow up the car. Instead, this was happening like in 20, 30 different places along the Gaza border all at once. And so that's what all these Apache helicopters were dispatched to do, was just, hey, make sure nobody gets back to Gaza, whether they're Hamas fighters or whether they're Israelis, because we don't want Hamas to have these captives and have the leverage against us that would bring.
So, okay, we have this information essentially. But this thing about the Apache helicopter, this report, it was an Israeli police investigation that essentially said this. But, and we reported it here at the Cradle, but then something interesting happened. And it seems like in some of the media, I don't know if in all of it, in Israel, this seems to have gotten scrubbed almost, or it seems like somebody wanted this story to change. Because now in Haaretz, the story is different. They're not saying exactly the same, right?
Yeah, so Israel has a long history of there being military censors that can approve or censor news stories. So we know that that's the case. Also, there was a report in the Israeli media, I think over at least 2 weeks ago, where they said that people who were promoting conspiracy theories about what happened on 7 October would be brought in for interrogation and arrested by the police. So there's clearly no free press. And so what we're seeing is that some of these stories that actually have Israelis themselves saying, yes, the Israeli army killed our own, those stories are pretty quickly getting censored. They'll come out for about a day and a half, and then pretty soon the story gets censored. So that happened again, as you mentioned, with this story in Haaretz, where there was the police investigation about the Nova rave, where the Apache helicopters came and opened fire on both Hamas fighters and Israelis. And so now, if you go back to that same Haaretz article online, that whole paragraph discussing that has been deleted. It's gone. So, of course, we have the original archive, so we know,
what they said,
what they actually said. But now, if someone goes to that same link on the Haaretz website, any mention that Israelis killed their own people that day is totally gone. And the similar thing happened with Yasmin Porat from Beri, who gave the testimony that the Israelis were firing tank shells into homes and killed all the hostages inside. Her original interview, I believe it was with the Khan broadcaster, Israeli broadcaster, that has been taken down. She did another interview with another Israeli paper called Maariv, and there's no mention in that the Israelis killed their own people. And she did a long interview with CNN. It was about 15 minutes, a video interview. And I watched the whole thing, and then when it comes to the part about what happened to the hostages that were in the house, it just skips over it and just says they just died.
They just died.
There's no mention of her saying, like in the past, that in fact the Israeli army showed up and opened fire and shot tanks into the homes and killed everyone. So there's this really concerted effort on the Israeli side to edit and censor anything that would indicate what really happened on 7th of October. And again, if Israelis even themselves talk about it, they could potentially be prosecuted, arrested, and interrogated.
In the West Bank, they are arresting people for posting on social media, even remotely in support of Gaza. They are getting arrested. They're rounded up.
Palestinians or Arab Israelis.
Yes, exactly. So what we're seeing here is it's not just a war, an armed war. It's a media war. It's an information war. And it makes you wonder what's going to happen to the Israeli captives in Gaza, of which there are hundreds. There are at least over 200. And it's been at this point 40-something days of a blitz. How many of them have died, and do they care?
Well, yeah, I don't think they do. I think the Israeli priority is to destroy Gaza. I mean, that's their priority. In addition to wanting to get rid of Gazans, they just need to they want to restore deterrence. They need to just kill as many Palestinians as they can to send a message to Hassan Nasrallah here in Lebanon, or send a message to the Iranians. Hey, don't intervene, otherwise, Beirut is going to be flattened just like Gaza is. Now,
they are saying
the Israelis do that? I mean, Hezbollah has a lot of rockets, and so could the Israelis really do that again like they did in 2006? I don't know, but at least that's the message the Israelis want to send, is like, look, we are totally crazy. We are willing to just literally commit genocide, like kill as many civilians as we need to. And so the last thing that the Israelis are worried about, yes, are their own hostages. And in fact, on the very day, October 7th, Bezalel Smotrich, in a cabinet meeting, he specifically said, this was reported in The Guardian, he said to the army, hit Hamas hard and do not consider the captives. He said, hit Hamas hard and do not take the captives into consideration. So, again, maybe that was a miscalculation on Hamas's part to assume that the Israelis would care about their captives, and they don't seem to. That's why Netanyahu has been sabotaging all of the negotiations. Every time it's reported that a deal is close to release the hostages, then a report comes out a few days later that Netanyahu just rejected it. They don't care. I mean, they just need the war, want the war to keep going.
I agree completely with you, Will. This seems to be entirely their design. What they want to do, it's deterrence on a biblical scale almost. William Bagwagenen, U.S. journalist, thank you so much for joining us today here at the Cradle News Roundup. So staying in the topic of Gaza, The regional resistance has also been taking a lot of action over the past month. Now we see a lot of attacks on US bases in Syria and Iraq from the Iraqi resistance. And we're also seeing a lot of action from Yemen, which over the past couple of days, they announced that they took control of an Israeli-owned ship in the Red Sea. Their statement that they released, the Yemeni armed forces, it says that they renew their warning to all ships belonging to the Israeli enemy or linked to it, that they will become a legitimate target for them. To further discuss this now, I'm being joined by writer and content creator for The Cradle, Karim Shami. How are you, Karim?
I'm good. How are you? Fine.
I'm great, man. I'm great. Glad to have you here. So, the Yemenis, they have been attacking southern Israel, essentially, Eilat, the settlement of Eilat. They have been launching ballistic missiles. They have been launching drones, most of them being shot down by the U.S. ships in the Red Sea. But now they're taking it a step further. They say they took control of an Israeli ship. What do you know about all of this?
Ansarullah in Yemen is the latest link to the axis of resistance, which is led by Iran and include the Iraqi resistance, the Lebanese resistance, and of course the resistance in Palestine and also Syria. Mm-hmm. So this link, many people thought it's like the weakest link. And of course, Israel and the US, I don't think they are prepared of what Yemen is doing, because I think they are prepared the rockets that Hamas is firing. They are prepared for Hezbollah. They are prepared in Syria and Iraq, and they were warned about these entities in these countries, and they clearly brought their ships and their aircraft carriers to counter Hezbollah and Syria. But I think Yemen was not discussed on the table, and that's why I feel what Yemen is doing will flip the table. So, as I mentioned, it's a real government. They are the decision makers, okay, and they are not influenced by
Ansarullah.
Ansarullah, yeah, of course. They are not influenced by other countries, or as Hezbollah in Lebanon, they have to inform all the parties what they are gonna do, and they have like tensions inside Lebanon, because now in Lebanon, maybe people don't know, half of the country, we can say they want war with Israel, but the other half don't want. So Ansarullah don't have this issue. And why Ansarullah are important is because they, besides the missiles and the drones that they have, also Yemen resides on Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is a narrow strait. It's around 25 kilometers, and it connects the Indian Sea the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea via the Red Sea. And this strait is very vital because it's around 25,000 ships pass through the strait every year, and around 5 to 6% of the oil that goes to Europe pass through there. So it's a very vital and important strait. And of course, because Yemen, they are the decision makers, and they decided to target Israel, and now we see that they seized an Israeli ship. In the future, if the tension rose in the region, and if the war persists and the slaughtering of Palestinians persists from the Israeli side, I think this will evolve, and we might see that Ansarullah will close the strait, because on both ways, Ansarullah, they are not benefiting from the strait, because usually all the customs are taken by UAE, which occupies parts of southern of Yemen, and countries and other entities prefer to deal with the UAE as if it controls the strait, and as if the custom must be paid for UAE, which later on it spread or it gives the money to its mercenaries in southern Yemen. So I don't think they have anything to lose. And
by joining, by
closing,
by closing the strait.
By closing the strait, mm-hmm. they might do it, because as we see, they escalated. First, people maybe don't know that Yemen is 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, and even so they try to target it more than once. And now this is the second step. And we have to know that both Israel and the US didn't retaliate of against the action of Ansarullah. So if they retaliate, I think the next step of Ansarullah might be closing the strait, and they indicated of closing the strait back in 2018, and they released footage of the equipment that they have to close the strait. And as I said, the strait is very narrow. It's 24 or 25 kilometers wide, so it's not that difficult.
So, you're saying Ansarullah essentially they speak for the country in a way, right?
Yes.
That's what you're saying. And it's very interesting because when this whole war started, we already knew about the axis of resistance. The U.S. was already, of course they know, they are aware. But their main concern was always Hezbollah.
Yes.
Their main concern was always Hezbollah because A, they're at the border, and B, because they're strong. Hezbollah has strength, not just in numbers, in armament. But what we've seen, the northern Israeli border has been completely lit up for the past month. It's just increasing. The settlements have been abandoned essentially. We've seen that. We've seen the attacks on the U.S. bases. We've seen, in Iraq and Syria, daily drone attacks, daily missile attacks. But even these, it seems like what the Yemenis are doing goes even further than this. It seems that because they've been trying to actually hit the Israeli settlements. In the south, they have to fly rockets or missiles. They have to fly them across the Red Sea, over Jordan, over Saudi Arabia, over the U.S. warships, and some of them have been landing.
Yes.
So, and when we get reports, when the Israelis say, there's an explosion in Eilat, maybe a day later, maybe a few hours later, the Yemeni come out and they say, no, actually, we fired maybe like half a dozen. We fired a dozen missiles. Like the ones that they're telling you about, they're not the ones you're hearing about. So does this speak, to because it's very, very new. It feels
100%.
Yemen. It feels very new, and the Israelis are blaming Iran. The Israelis blame Iran for Yemen.
Yeah, of course they will blame. Just to clarify things for our listeners. First, when the Yemenis send drones, usually the drones are downed by U.S. ships and even by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. But when they send the ballistic missiles, usually the ballistic missiles escape the atmosphere of Earth and goes to the outer space, and then it lands directly in Israel. That's why when we hear that Israel downed it, usually they use their own air defense capabilities.
They say they use the arrow defense.
Yeah, arrow defense, which is specifically used for ballistic missiles. That's why we don't hear about Iron Dome when the Yemenis.
Because Iron Dome is for the rockets.
Yeah, it's for rockets and short-range rockets, while the Sling is for ballistic missiles that come maybe from outer space. And the Israelis said that it was the first attempt to down a missile from outer space. And to compare what Hezbollah is doing and the Yemenis are trying to do, to answer your question first, what Hezbollah is doing will only affect the Israelis and the Israeli government. They target missile, even though if they invade northern Israel, only Lebanon and this region will be affected, and Israel will be affected, of course, as what happened in October the 7th. But what the Yemenis are doing will affect the whole world. It's not only Israel or the Yemenis, because, as I said,
you mean because of the
strait? The strait will have an international impact, especially that we have an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and the whole West.
And we cannot forget that Yemen has been at war for 9 years. Again, before this whole disaster, this horrible situation that is unfolding in Gaza, Yemen was essentially the world's worst humanitarian disaster. About 400,000 people killed, millions displaced, just leveled to the ground with US bombs by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, by NATO weapons and support. Israelis are present in Yemen, in the Socotra Island. So I think you're completely right when you say is that essentially the West has been sleeping on Yemen, and they are coming out of nowhere, and they essentially seem to be putting their money where their mouth is. They seem to be willing to go all into this, and that's that just it speaks to how different the world is today
Yes, 100%.
to just 5 years ago.
Yeah, 100%. First, we can say that they are the only Arabs that have balls nowadays. Okay, and specifically when I went to social media yesterday, because I was curious to see the comments over on maybe Saudi Arabian social media, what's happening. And I was happy to see that even the Saudi Arabians that consider Yemen as an enemy, they are praising Yemen and they are saying that you Yemenis have balls and we respect you. The same accounts that are like trying to shut down Yemen since 7-8 years, now they are praising Yemen. And this also tell us that the pivot point of Arabs, or the main topic or cause for Arabs, is the Palestinian. But we're hoping to see a translation of what's happening on social media and on the street to the Arab rulers.
To actually policy,
Yeah, but
to policy.
till now, I don't see.
And thank you all for joining us today. This has been the Cradle News Roundup. Don't forget to leave a like, to subscribe, follow us on X, on Instagram, on Telegram. For the Cradle News Roundup, my name is Esteban Carrillo. I have been joined today by U.S. journalist William McWagener and content creator and writer for the Cradle, Karim Shami. Thank you guys so much.